Dr. Pritish is presently working as an assistant professor of English at Acharya Sukumar Sen Mahavidyalaya in West Bengal. He is a former Fulbright foreign language teacher assistant at New York University from 2018 to 2019. He has obtained his PhD from West Bengal State University and has obtained his MPhil degree from Calcutta University. He is researching on superhero comic books of Batman and Indian comics. He is interested in creative writing and has published a long story in Kindle Direct Publishing. He has also penned a couple of scripts for comic books, which is awaiting publication. And he has also published several articles in national and international journals and has chapters in books, and also has attended few seminars and conferences both in India and abroad. On behalf of Team Dadwaj, Dr. Priti, it's an absolute honor and pleasure to welcome you once again. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for accepting the invitation and also taking on again the challenge of teaching the heterogeneous group. Without wasting much time, the platform is all yours, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Banerjee. So let's get on with it. As you can see, I will be speaking on I.A. Richards and practical criticism. So a practical note for me and for everyone else is that we often make this mistake of calling I.A. Richards as I.A. Richard. So it's I.A. Richards. In fact, I made this mistake once, and one of my teachers told me, no, there's an S at the end of Richard. So you need to remember this. And I whenever I take up I.A. Richards, I make a point so that I don't make the same mistake as I made in that class. So let's go ahead with the next slide. Okay, let me know when if you face any problems when the slides are not changing, because it might
Definitely.
happen sometimes. Okay, so it's the next slide is this. So I mean, I. Richards is of course considered one of the fathers of new criticism along with T.S. Eliot. But within this lecture, we might find that this is not really very true, because new criticism and I.A. Richards parted ways on a number of ways than more number of ways than they were like together. Anyway, so this is on your um, right screen. You can find I.A. Richards, a young person. So he did his college, and he did his graduation and masters from Clifton College and Magdalen College. But he studied philosophy. He did not study English as a subject. And but then he started teaching English as a subject for the first time, and it was included as a subject of study in 1919, and he was one of the first teachers to teach English as a separate subject. And it had a lot to do the way in which he wrote his books, because he was a teacher of English literature, and by literature he was more of a teacher of English poetry. And whatever we are going to learn about him, we will keep in mind that he tried to explain, and he tried to understand what literature is through his uh, training as in the discipline of philosophy and later psychology. So he went to teach in his alma mater as well, and then he was a visiting professor, and where he was teaching basic English and poetry at Tsinghua University, Beijing, and ultimately he went on to teach at Harvard University from 1939 onwards. So Richards, before we go into Richards the critic, we might also see how Richards was as a poet. So Richards published three collections of poetry, and these are the names of these books that he wrote. All of these are anthologies of poems in 1958, 60, and 71, and his collections of poems were published in 1978. And one of the critics, Helen Wendler, described his poetry as gnarled, intellectual, angular, unsparing. So, I mean, these are the he was writing during the modern age, and his poetry had the qualities of the modern intelligent upper class or modern intelligent university graduate who was writing intellectual and gnarled poetry. So, what were the influences on Richards? I mean, who made Richards who he was? So, Richards was a scholar in semantics, and along with C.K. Ogden, he created this book called Basic English, and he was also studying the psychology, and especially the psychology of Charles Scott Sherrington, and he was understanding, or he was trying to study the psychological theory of value, and it was these psychological studies that he tried to incorporate into his criticism of poetry. And the photographs of the people whom I am referring to are mentioned here. It is always good to remember a person and a person's contribution, or a person's book, if we can associate it with some kind of an image. And he also he was Swinburne. He was influenced by uh, Swinburne, one of the pre-Raphaelite poets, and his Erechtheus. He was reading this poetry, and in his practical criticism, he remembered how this particular poem, how this particular drama actually influenced his way of looking at literature. So, uh, I included this. I mean, I did not find it in any book that I read about I.A. Richards, but I think I.A. Richards wanted literary criticism to approach the conditions of science, exactitude, and in this case, in this sense, Aristotle could also be considered to be one of the influences, because I believe one of the very first critics of drama or poetry. I mean, poetry was understood to be everything that literature now means. So, Aristotle was also pointing towards, or Aristotle was also writing criticism on the exactitude or on the approaches of science, which I think I.A. Richards also inherited. Now, let's consider the importance of his works. But before we go into the importance of his works, we have to know what works he created. Now, this is plainly for the purposes of information, and he began writing and co-authoring with a number of people initially. He began writing with the foundations of aesthetics, and then he wrote the meaning of meaning, and in 1923, 1924, 1926. However, I included I tried to include as many works as I could find or could understand to be of importance to us. But we also have practical criticism from 1929, Coleridge on imagination, philosophy of rhetoric, and so on and so forth. So now this slide talks about what is the importance of these works that we are seeing here. We are seeing here kind of 11 works, 11 books, and what was the importance, or how did it impact literary criticism or literature or literary history through his creations. So number one, I think the biggest impact that I.A. Richards made to criticism and to the history of criticism is that it gave rise to new criticism and formalism. Why and how we will discuss soon, but these are one of the direct or indirect influences or importances of I.A. Richards' work. Now, he was trying to prove or providing exactitude of sciences into literary criticism. He was, I mean, I will also try to discuss why he wanted to do that. I mean, why did he want to have why did he want to have why didn't he want literary criticism to have the exactitude of science? I mean, what was the requirement for that? And then he also paved the way for the development of deconstruction, because Richards too said that nothing was outside the text. And I'm like, I'm having this hangover from my deconstruction class earlier, where I was thinking about deconstruction, and I found that what Richards had said way back in 1929 or the 1930s or 40s resonated with what was being said in the 1960s, but of course in a very different way. He influenced F.R. Lewis, who wrote The New Bearings in Poetry, and then influenced William Empson, who was his direct student. He was also one of the influencers, like not Instagram influencers, but like real influencers on the Chicago School, where John Crow Ransom and W.K. Wimsatt and others used to work and research. So the works of Richards helped dissociate the text from two types of fallacies, both the intentional and the affective, which was the exact topics, which were the exact names of books written by Wimsatt and Beardsley in the Verbal Icon. They were like talking about these fallacies. And then Richards gave us, or through the books, through the works, the importance of the books was this, that it gave us an objective way of looking at subjective utterings. And this in some way explains why Richards wanted to have this exactitude of science into literary criticism. Remember, we are saying that, I am saying that, or I thought I understood from Richards that he did not want literature to be measured by exact sciences, but he wanted to have some standardization procedures when somebody is doing a literary criticism. Okay, we will talk more about it when we go a little further into the presentation. And then he could also be considered to be the grandfather of reception theory or the reader response theory. Why? Because which I don't think will be discussed in this PPT, but I think there is one of the four meanings does talk about this, um, how it creates certain feelings inside the reader, how it creates, how a literary text or a poem can create certain feelings in the mind of the reader, which is somehow associated with reader response theory. Now, what were the techniques and basic principles of Richards? So there are three basic techniques in which he wanted to read a text, and these are the close reading of the text. And the close reading of the text is, of course, the icons of new criticism, or the icons or the iconic words of practical criticism and new criticism both. Now, I have like tried to use some memes to explain what I am trying to say. So if we have seen this meme a lot in Facebook, I think, and I see this meme a lot, that there are some aspects of things which are highlighted, which are given more importance, and then there are certain aspects which are not given much importance. So close reading of the text requires that the text is given the utmost focus, which is happening here in this picture, in this meme, and the critic or the reader, according to I.A. Richards, will be paying more and more attention to the text, while the author is in a sticky situation. The author is like sinking, and what happens to race, milieu, and moment is at the bottom of the lake. Nobody wants to if you are doing practical criticism, if you are doing new criticism, you are not going to take into consideration the race, milieu, and moment propounded by Hippolyte Taine in 1863. So another aspect or another technique or another basic principle of practical criticism is that you will disengage, or the critic should disengage from the race, milieu, and moment. So these were the things: the race, milieu, and the moment, where the three aspects, were the three elements, according to Taine, that gave any text its distinctive feature. But I.A. Richards was very much against this. And if I.A. Richards would have created a meme, I think he would have been very happy to see this meme doing the rounds in Facebook or other social media. And then he also says that there is no separate aesthetic state. And he says this in the second chapter of the Principles of Literary Criticism. He says that there is no separate aesthetic state of a writer or of a reader. I will share a small anecdote. And I was thinking about this aesthetic state. I was trying to analyze if I.A. Richards was saying the right thing or not. Is there truly an aesthetic state in which a writer or in which a poet can create a particular literary work or work of art? Or when the reader reads the text, does the reader gets transported to that aesthetic state? I was trying to write a story, and I thought that I have often observed in many movies, and maybe even in some comic books that I have read, that the author is stylishly smoking a cigarette and writing or typing whatever the author is doing. And I thought, why not try a cigarette myself, and let's go to that aesthetic state. Let's see if smoking a cigarette somehow affects my way of writing, or affects or creates any kind of state of mind inside me. Well, I'll tell you the result at the end of the presentation, so that you might stay for a longer length of time and hear me. Just if you're just interested that whether the smoking of the cigarette really helped me reach that aesthetic state. And just a note: I don't smoke. I mean, I'm not a smoker. I'm a teetotaler. But did it help? We will come to that later. But according to T.S. Eliot, there is no aesthetic state from which a poet or a writer writes, or there is no aesthetic state where the poet or the writer reaches first, stays there, and writes from it. Neither for the reader. So the example that he gave, of course, I think was Kubla Khan. Or he also tried to explain it in these terms, that looking at a work of art is similar to our act of looking at anything else. We look. There is no different way in which we look at things. We look, and then we appreciate it, or we ignore it, or we do not appreciate it. That's it. That's it according to I.A. Richards. There is no point at which we enter into a separate state of mind, or we enter into a separate way of looking at things, according to I.A. Richards. Let's move on to the next slide, and this is the principles and the ideas continuing. So I have also again tried to use memes. Sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's not, but I thought it was funny for me, and when I work, I think I should be smiling or I should be enjoying my work, so I do these things. Do let me know if you do not find it funny. So the the fourth principle or the fourth idea of I.A. Richards is that uh, one should not go after authors' undeclared intentions. Like, whatever words are printed on the paper, whatever things have been typed on the paper or written on the paper, do not always betray the intentions of the author. And if the author declares certain intentions, only then accept it. And he was giving the example of Kubla Khan, that what was the intention of Kubla Khan, what was the intention of Coleridge writing Kubla Khan. And he said that he spoke against a very complex explanation given by another critic, and he said that Kubla, the Xanadu and this enchanted areas, this enchanted land was actually the fallout of Coleridge reading Purchas's Pilgrimage, and he had or he was reading Milton's Paradise Lost book 4, and where from he created these beautiful images, and it had nothing to do with the kinds of dreams that he talks about. Okay, so that was his idea of not going after authors' undeclared intentions, but we have to pay attention to the word undeclared. If the author writes something and says that I want the reader to understand this, then of course we can take it for granted that the author wants to write this. So this meme is trying to explain, the meme on the right is trying to explain, this is again a very used meme in Facebook, and I use these meme to communicate with my students. So the reader wants to go after the author's undeclared intentions, which is a very satisfying exercise sometimes, that we can create a sense of identification with the author when we sort of understand that, okay, this is why the poet has written this. Because I already said that why would I.A. Richards want to have the exactitude of science in literary criticism? I am indulging in this undeclared intentions myself, but I am not I.A. Richards, and it is my opinion as to why he thought it should be done. So the reader goes after the author's undeclared intentions, and now you can guess who is stopping the reader or the critic from going after the author's undeclared intentions. So I hope that helps you remember one of the basic principles of literary criticism by I.A. Richards. Next is that he says that our value of life can be improved. It could be done through the arts. The arts can communicate valuable experiences. So he believes, or he thinks, I.A. Richards thinks that there is a possibility that the values of life can be improved. Maybe they can be improved, and it can be done through the arts. In here, he is specially indebted to many utilitarian critics, including Sir Philip Sidney. Philip Sidney also said a similar thing in defense of poetry, where he said that art communicates experiences in such a way that we remember it for the better, and we can improve our life following art. Like if we see a selfless hero giving away his life for his beloved, then maybe we will also learn to be selfless, and we can also do selfless acts of heroics to save our people, or save anybody who is in some kind of trouble. So arts can experience valuable experiences, but he did not really dwell on the procedure in which the arts can communicate valuable experiences, because initially he said that there is no special aesthetic state where which art can take you, or where from the reader reads, or where from the artist works. But we are not talking about aesthetic value, perhaps we are talking about value as we understand the value of, say, a good teacher, say a good friend, that kind of value, not some kind of aesthetic value, but it's a kind of a real valuable stuff that we can gain, which will be valuable for our life, which will be valuable for our future. It borders on this didactic or moralistic way of looking at things. But remember, we have to remember that I.A. Richards was a modern critic, and he could not dwell too much upon this. He did not dwell too much. I'm sorry, I should not say could not, but he did not dwell on this moralistic preaching and didacticism too much. But he did say that arts can communicate valuable experiences. So that is a utilitarian Benthamite um, um, aspect of practical criticism, which is always there. Then art adds value sorry, to our lives. It helps us shape our impulses. The meme on the left is also a very common meme. So Richards is saving the readers or the critics from this idea of art for art's sake. I'm just exaggerated it a bit, but what he tries to say is that, I mean, art for art's sake is not something that is acceptable to him. He considers that art is something that gives value to our lives. More importantly, it helps us shape our impulses. Like, whatever impulse we have, like if we are getting angry, or if we are if we want to eat too much, or if we are becoming too sad, then when during those times, if we create some kind of art, or if we read a good literature, read a good poem, then our impulses will be shaped for the good. That's what he believed in, that's what he thought. Let's go to the next slide, which is also memified or memified, whatever you want to call it. So this slide is on language. What are his views on language? So he believes that language has two uses. One is scientific, that is denotative, and another is emotive or connotative. For example, your eyes are blue like the sky. Now, this same sentence can have a denotative meaning and can have a connotative meaning. So what is the denotative meaning? I mean, if you are a scientist, how will you take this line that your eyes are blue like the sky? I think if I were a scientist, I'm a pseudoscientist, I cannot think like a scientist, so I would think, okay, so somebody is trying to replicate the color of the sky, which is not really the color of the sky, but the color, the blue radiation of the sun, and replicating that blue radiation of sun upon the eyes of a person. But the scientist might also say that there is no eye, and there is no color of eye which could be blue as the sky, and so on and so forth. The scientist will never be saying this pickup line for to a beautiful lady. But the emotive or the connotative meaning could simply mean that somebody is praising somebody's eyes. Somebody is praising somebody's clarity, or somebody is praising somebody's horizon of understanding, horizon of thinking, by saying that your eyes are as wide as the sky because they are blue, and so on and so forth. Connotative meanings, according to Richards, is something that can multiply on its own. whereas denotative is like one single thing that should mean whatever it is being said. So the first should have unambiguous and direct sense. The second can and should have multiple meanings. That's what I said just now. And the meme, I tried to create this meme. I'm very bad at creating memes, but I thought this might give some support, some substantiation to whatever I'm saying. So I think many of you have enjoyed Tom and Jerry in your childhood. I still enjoy them. I still like to see Tom and Jerry. So Tom is saying to this lady cat that you set my soul on fire, but he is holding the dog, and the dog is not very happy about it because the dog has replaced the lady cat. Whereas the lady cat might think about love, or Tom might be sorry, thinking about love, but the dog is thinking about fire. So when and even this image is very ambiguous. This image is very I mean, we can problematize this image by saying that Tom is actually, Tom, who is a male person or the male cat, is kissing a male dog. This could be this could have been problematic way back in the 1930s. Even in 1960s it could have been problematic, but today we don't see it from the eyes of any kind of gendering. We just enjoy it, we just laugh our guts out whenever we see this image or this um, video, this cartoon. So the third thing that Richards say is that language reflects reality. He believed that what I say is what I mean. I mean, here Saussure and Richards had a similarity of thinking, whereas Saussure firmly believed that language is definitely arbitrary, that language is language the terms in the language only relate to um, um, other things. The words in a language are in a relationship, and you don't really have any particular reality as such. But I.A. Richards believed, I mean, he understood whatever Saussure said, that okay, language cannot, the words are not real. But what I.A. Richards thought or he believed, that these words actually point towards reality. Say if I say clock, there's a clock over my head. If I say clock, then you will imagine a clock, or you will see a clock. Many of you might see how much time I have already taken from you. So these things is, I.A. Richards believed that language somehow reflects reality, which the modern and postmodern, I mean postmodern, especially postmodern critics, denied completely, that language is far away from reality. And all of these issues that have been discussed here, or these three things on language, he discusses these issues in chapter 34 of the Principles of Literary Criticism, these three issues that we mentioned here. Let's come to the four kinds of meanings, one of the other contributions of I.A. Richards. And in Practical Criticism, page number 336, he writes that the only proper attitude is to look upon a successful interpretation, a correct understanding, as a triumph against odds. We must cease to regard a misinterpretation as a mere unlucky accident. We must treat it as the normal and probable event. So he is saying that the proper attitude should be that a successful interpretation or a correct understanding is a triumph against odds. That means it is very usual, it is very common for us to make a misinterpretation, which is not an unlucky accident. It is a normal and probable event, because it is the misinterpretation that happens more than interpretations, than correct understanding. In this way, I think he is doing two things. First, he is normalizing misinterpretation, that it's okay to misinterpret. But he is also saying that correct understanding is a triumph. I believe somewhere, like Eliot, he did engage in some kind of a intellectual elitism, that me being a lay person cannot interpret, cannot have a correct understanding of a poem. If I am a student, if I am a layman, I will be making mistakes. That is very expected of me. But after reading practical criticism, maybe we will not make the same mistakes, because we will be taught in the sciences of criticism. We will know what is a misinterpretation and what is a successful interpretation, according to Richards. So what are these four kinds of meanings? Sense. The first kind of meaning is sense. What does it do? Sense is the state object to which the words direct the reader's attention. Now, these pictures, I hope all of you have realized what these pictures relate to, what these pictures direct to, which the first two pictures from left will tell you that they are referring to some great poems by some great writers. The first is, of course, the Nightingale, the Ode to Nightingale, and then Daffodils. But the last one does not really direct to any poem, but it's the state of mind. It's a sadness. When somebody say, "I'm sad," and I'm depressed, I am not, I'm feeling unhappy, then this image could be a relative, could be a reflection of this state or object that the sense meaning can communicate. So when a poet is saying about a nightingale and a daffodil or sadness, then our minds could be directed to these sensory objects. We hear the nightingale, we see the daffodils, or we feel the pain of the particular person who is in pain. But I see now that in the daffodil picture there is also a heart shape carved out curiously within the clouds. I wonder if that was there in daffodils. Anyway, that might be the mistake of the person who created this picture. Next is feeling. So another kind of meaning is related to feeling. Now, I was talking about this kind of meaning when I was talking about what kind of feelings or what kind of emotions can a poem create in the mind of the reader or the critic. Sorry. So, according to Richards, feeling is a kind of meaning which is related to the range of emotions presented through the words present on the page. And I have used this example of a poem by Whitman, "O Captain, My Captain," because when I was reading this poem, my mind was in my mind the hope and betrayal, hope and despair, life and death jostled with each other. That the captain is dead, but they have won, they have come to the shore, but the captain is dead. The captain has managed to steer them into clear waters, into stable grounds, but the captain is dead. So the range of emotions presented in this particular poem is huge. It, as I said, that hope and despair are like, in a close bond in this poem. But I don't think Richards ever used this poem in his analysis. Next comes tone. The meaning of tone. What is the tone of the speaker, of the author? So tone is the speaker's attitude towards the reader or audience, and it could be many, as I mentioned here: satirical, ironic, humorous, or empathetic. Again, I use these emojis to make these words more visual. There are many among us who are more visual people, and they can relate to the satirical or the ironic or the humorous and the empathetic tone of the speaker. Now, this could create a little confusion, as it created for me, because I read a book as if I am a student, and I try to understand when I will be teaching it, when I will be discussing it with some other people, what at what point could they think that this is not going in the right direction. So tone is the speaker's attitude towards the reader or the audience. Is the speaker or is the author trying to be satirical? Is the author trying to be ironic? Is the author or speaker trying to be humorous at the expense of someone else? Is the author or the writer wants to be witty? Or is there an empathy in the tone of the speaker or the author or the writer? Is he one with the pain of the people? Now, I think we need to stop here and spend a minute or try to apply practical criticism practically on some texts. Say, for example, we all know about The Rape of the Lock by Alexander Pope. And we all know the attitude of Pope towards the character Belinda. We know that Pope is very satirical to some aspects of Belinda, and mostly towards the present society, the society that was present during that time. He also used a number of irony. At times it was really very humorous, it was really very funny, but I did not find any point where the author was empathetic towards any one of the characters. The same is true with, say, um, Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. That's one of the bitterest satires in English literature, and he was satirical, he was ironic, but at times he was humorous. Empathy, maybe I found empathy with the Winnims, but not with any other human or non-human entities presented in the text. However, there could be a catch in this, especially in the cases of dramatic monologues, where the speaker and the author will be two very different people. The situation will be very different in real drama, in plays, where the speakers are not cannot be equated with the authors. However, we must remember that I.A. Richards was writing on poetry. His main aspect of criticism, his main aspect of analysis was usually poetry, but he mentions it himself in the book that sorry, that by poetry he means all literature. I mean, he was following maybe his Greek master, who believed that poetry means literature and literature means poetry. So in in works of art other than poetry, but even in dramatic poetry, it is difficult to understand what is the speaker's attitude. But from the use of the words, we will be able to make that out. And that is what practical criticism teaches us. Fourth is the intention. Intention is the effect which the author is trying to bring about by his words. Again, words. Okay, so there are certain words on the text. What is the effect that is being brought by the words that are present on the paper? For example, we have read Ode to the Nightingale, and we know that Keats suffered from tuberculosis, and that he was a tragic fellow, and that his girlfriend ditched him, and that he was, I mean, a hero for me, because he died trying to save his brother. He was trying to cure his brother from TB, and he got TB from him, and actually he died from TB. There's a line in that particular poem, a burning forehead and a parching tongue. When I first read it, those words did not really hit me as much as it hit me when my teacher told me that, these are the symptoms of TB, that you have a high temperature and you will feel thirsty. And then I realized, oh my God, this guy was actually talking about the real pain that he felt when he was writing this poem. But then, practical criticism is talking against this kind of engagement with the author's biography. Practical criticism is saying, do not engage with this kind of a play with the author's life. Try to focus on the effect that you have from the words that you see on the text. But why I said this is because the words a parching forehead and a burning tongue, or a burning forehead and a parching tongue, those words did not affect me that much. But then there were other words, like when I was reading a poem by Dylan Thomas, the words were arranged in such a manner, the letters were arranged in such a manner, or maybe if we take for example Lake Isle of Innisfree by W.B. Yeats, there the words induce a sense of lulling of the senses. The words themselves create a sense of calmness, a sense of catharsis, a sense of sleep in my mind. And I tried to differentiate between these kinds of effects and the effects that came to me when I read about the life of a particular author. But when you read a particular author's life and try to equate that point in time with the words written on the text, then according to I.A. Richards, you are not doing it right. You are doing it right only when you are affected by whatever is being written on the paper. What you are reading is important, and how it affects you is one of the meanings, is one of the four meanings that you need to search in the text or from the text. Let's move to the book itself, Practical Criticism. It was first published in 1929, and objectives according to I.A. Richards were these three: to document the contemporary state of culture, to provide a new technique to respond to poetry, to reform the teaching of literature, whereas the first sorry is not really in consonance with whatever we have uh, read or sorry done this far. But the second and the third objectives, according to I.A. Richards, for writing practical criticism, is to provide a new technique to respond to poetry, because, as I mentioned earlier, that English was not a department, English was not considered, English literature was not considered a separate discipline that could be studied formally. So you need to have some formal standard ways of doing something. There are formal ways to study rhetoric, there are formal ways to study mathematics, there are formal ways to study philosophy, but Richards was among the first people who started teaching English as a separate discipline of study. It was a new thing that was being started to be taught at Cambridge. So he needed this new technique to respond to the poetry, and his views on language, his views on meanings, because he was also a scholar of semantics, was utilized to create this new technique with the help of which poetry could be responded to, and to reform the teaching of literature. So literature was being taught, but taught in a very unstandardized manner, and he wanted to reform this teaching of literature, especially in colleges and universities. The next idea of practical criticism, or the next uh, uh, essence of practical criticism, are the protocols. What are these protocols? These are the set of comments from the students of Cambridge to whom Richards gave some poems, 13 poems. He gave the students 13 poems without the authorship, and this book, Practical Criticism, which is a monster of a book, this is like 400 pages, is all built up on the kind of comments that the students provided to him. And these comments, these sets of comments, were called protocols by Richards. And what does the book do? The book analyzes the various mistakes of interpretation and understanding of poetry. So whatever mistakes and misinterpretations his students did, he tried to take a note of those things, and he analyzed them. He did not want to correct them, but he wanted to analyze, and through this analysis he was trying to document the contemporary state of culture. So and he found that these are the obstacles to the proper analysis of poetry according to Richards. And these obstacles have been taken from this edition, 1964 edition, Routledge and Kagan. So the first difficulty is making out sorry the plain sense of poetry. The first and foremost thing is that you need to understand what does the poem mean at all. Maybe its literal meaning, its denotative meaning. That is the first thing that many people failed at, that what is being said at all, कहना क्या चाहते हो, from poetry. Many people simply failed to do that. Then the difficulty was of sensuous apprehension. So there were many people who did not appreciate the sound, the rhythm, or the movement of the text. Like they just read the poem, and they had no ear for the sound, they had no ear for the rhythm, and they did not even understand what are the architectural or architectonic ways in which the movement actually is built, the ways in which the poem is actually built. And then the problems of imagery, visual imagery. So the readers were found to have poor imaging capacity. Imagination was lacking. There was a failure of imagination among the students, that they could not imagine a number of things. I mean, just imagine if you are reading Ode to the Nightingale and you do not see the Queen Moon happily on her throne, then I think we are suffering from problem C. What was problem D? Mnemonic irrelevancies. The reader remembers some personal experience which is not relevant to the poem. Okay, so that happens to us a lot. Like, when I read sorry, when I am reading, say, Last Ride Together, and when I was reading it for the first time in my graduation days, I started remembering the last class that I shared with one of my crushes. I thought I loved this girl, and I started imagining, or I started to equate the last ride the author mentions and the last class that I shared in my school with this particular lady. According to Richards, this is not relevant to the poem. You again are going away from the poem. You are going into your memories. Mnemonic is the adjective of memory. So your memory and how you read the poem through your memory is irrelevant. You should not bring in your memories into the text. Stock responses. The reader may have fully prepared views and emotions which are simply triggered off by the poem. He does not respond. He or she, sorry. I mean, he is being mentioned by Richards. So I just copy pasted the entire thing here. Consider it to be an image rather than some writing. So he or she does not respond to the poem in the question. He or she has their own set of answers ready. For example, when I was young, I used to hear this story my father told, that a boy prepared an essay on an alligator or a crocodile, and in the real exam he was asked to write an essay on an aeroplane. And so he wrote that the aeroplane crashed into a river, and there were many crocodiles, and he started writing on the crocodile. So this is the crocodile syndrome, I would say. And teachers among us would know very well that this is a plague. The student has not prepared an answer on the question that has come in the question paper, and he or she writes whatever he wants to write. So this is a failure of appreciating the poem. Then there is sentimentality. The reader may be too emotional. So if in the middle of the class you are teaching, say, Macbeth's tragedy, and somebody starts to cry because Lady Macbeth has died, or because Macbeth has wasted his potential to be a great warrior and has become a murderer, too much sentimentality, the reader's emotions often get into the way of analyzing the text. We might not see the vital clues if we are teary-eyed. We will not appreciate the poem through our raw sentiments, but we also have to have an objective distance while we are, even if we are enjoying the poem, we should have some kind of an objective distance, which is very difficult to maintain, because the writer the writer did not think who it will make cry, but the the way in which the story moves can bring us to tears. And Aristotle's theory of catharsis is actually based on this experience. But too much of that is a problem. Too much of anything will be a problem. Inhibition. So what is inhibition? The opposite extreme to sentimentality. The reader experiences less emotion than he ought to. Well, Ophelia dies in Hamlet, and I start to laugh like a maniac in the classroom, and my teacher will kick me out because she would think that, you know, this person is an idiot, or this person has no emotions, has no um, sentiments. How can you laugh when somebody like Ophelia is dead? Doctrinal additions. Now this is serious, and this is a serious problem. So, I mean, according to Richards, and Richards writes that sorry, poetry may contain or imply certain beliefs about the world, or at least seem to contain certain views. A clash between the reader's own views and the views he finds expressed in the poetry are a fertile source of erratic judgment. Now this happens with racist literature. This happens with sexist literature, which we call racist and sexist now, might not have been racist or sexist then. For example, I think it was Tom Sawyer. What's the other another novel in which Tom Sawyer was, and there was this person of African descent, Tom. I can't remember the name right now. This is what is happening to me. But in that novel, which is not Tom Sawyer novel, the other novel, which I will remember when I will be dreaming tonight, there is this person of African descent, and he is being called a Negro so many times. And Mark Twain has no qualms about calling a Negro, because a Negro was a Negro when Tom Sawyer, or this novel, whose name I cannot recall right now, was written. If we consider this literature to be not readable only because some racist term is being used there, then we are making a mistake. Or if we see the other way around, if we see a text which does not coalesce, which is not found in consonance with our doctrinal additions, that okay, I am a vegetarian, and in this text meat eating has been promoted, so I will not read that text, or I will hate that text. That is something that is doctrinal additions would lead to. And I do not know how much importance I.A. Richards gave to this particular aspect, but I think one of the biggest takeaways from practical criticism could be an analysis or a reading of these doctrinal additions. Then the effects of technical presuppositions. So when a poem succeeds by using a certain technique, we expect similar themes to be handled with the same technique and do not respond when a new or different technique is used. The converse is also true. If a technique has failed in one case, we jump to the conclusion that the technique itself is useless. Many readers make this mistake of confusing cause and effect. So as Dr. Banerjee had pointed out earlier, that I have a special way of saying things or conducting my classes, which includes memes and which includes some kind of humorous interjections, which worked once, which might work twice, but if I cannot do it every time, I cannot depend on my mere sense of humor to keep the class alive. It cannot happen every time. But because I do the same thing with my students in my college, they expect that I will say something very funny, that I will make faces at them, that I will maybe dance in the class, which I did once or twice, which had very bad consequences. But the thing is that one technique might work in one poem, the same technique might fail bitterly in another, and the readers are biased towards certain techniques. If you are Keats, you better write odes. You cannot write a sonnet. If you are if you are Sydney, then you cannot write an epic. You stick to sonnets. If you are, say, Shah Rukh Khan, you should not, you know, do serious movies. You should do romantic movies. But if we have that prejudice in our minds, then we will never appreciate a new poem or a new movie or a person doing something different than what that person is, what the person usually does. And then general critical preconceptions. The reader may have preconceived notions about the nature and value of poetry. Whether these preconceptions are conscious or unconscious, they create an obstacle between the reader and the poem. I guess I'm very sorry for this constant cough. I think I have catch cold, or maybe worse. But let's continue. So we have some conceptions about a number of things around us. If I write a poem, then you might think, oh, who is this guy? Why? How can he even write a poem? I mean, look at him. He is bald. Bald people don't write poems, but I think Shakespeare was also bald. I'm not comparing myself with him. But these are certain preconceptions about the value or nature of poetry or literature, that a 10-year-old cannot write as good as a, say, a mature person of 40, or poetry written about say a snail must be very humorous or must be very funny, as opposed to a poetry written on, say, drought. So these things can create a sort of obstacle between the reader and the poem. Sorry, let's go to the next slide. Now, I have tried to point out the authorship of the poems, like who wrote, or which poems were actually utilized. So I'm not reading them out, all of them. You can take a screenshot, or you can just read it from the screen, or you might have the entire PPT from Dr. Banerjee, when I have provided it to him, but I think I did not include this slide, which was an afterthought. So if you go through the list of the poems, if you go through all the 13 poems, I think and I question Richards as on what basis did he choose these poems? Why did he choose these poems? Because most of these poems are not too famous, and some of these poems are like not really very known to a number of people. So why did he choose these poems? Okay, and these are the sorry 13 poems. Um, the poem 10 is by G.H. Lewes, and it is in Cambridge Poetry and Anthology, but he doesn't mention which poem it was, or maybe I deleted it by mistake. I will find out and say if it is a mistake. And the other poems are all right. So these poems, you can go through them and you can try to understand why would Richards only choose these 13 poems and not some other poems. And in choosing these poems, did he make a mistake that he was trying to avoid, that he was trying to tell his other poems, not other students, not to make the same mistakes. Now, let us understand this stress on close textual analysis, we might have a practical exercise right now for 2 minutes. You can read this poem and you can like send in your comments. You now know which things to avoid, and you can have like your comments on the poem, and you can like email me, or you can write them down in the chat box, because since we are doing this um, practical criticism, I thought maybe we can have a practical exercise for a few minutes. So read the poem and come up with any comments that you wish to make, though I will not be able to see them right now because I have this whole screen uh, here, and if I go out then the screen might be disrupted, but I will see the comments at the question answer in the question answer session. Take a screenshot or read it, and just take a minute and read the poem. It's not a big poem. I mean, actually, it's not an entire. Okay, yeah. I mean, yeah. Just read it. Just say whatever you feel about this poem in a line or two in the chat box, or maybe in my email when I provide it to you. Take a minute.
Just for the information of the participants, the chat box is open. You can type in the comments in the chat box.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Banerjee. Thank you. I mean, I hope it is okay. I mean, this is a kind of a surprise to you, maybe, but I think
it's absolutely fine. Other resource persons have also done it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay, so I will change the slide and if you have just switched in, just take the screenshot or just read it for the sake of a practical exercise, and we will analyze the comments at the end if the time permits us. Let's move to the next aspect of Richard's ideas. So, I mean, when I say that nothing is outside the text, when I say that Richards was paying a lot of attention on the text itself, the words in the text, the language, I'm not saying, or Richards never said, that the context is absolutely useless. Of course it is. And Richards explains his stance on the context. He's saying that he posited the text as an autonomous unit, but he did not say that it is something out of the blue. The author is completely disregarded, or the context is completely disregarded. Otherwise, the meaning will only be a kind of a isolated event, which poem or which literature never is or never could be. So he writes that a context is a set of entities, things or events related in a certain way. So the context is a word which has been used as all important. Words have different meanings in different contexts. So what he wants to say is that while a context is important, it is not all important. It is not something that decides whether you interpret the poem correctly or not. So the context becomes secondary, and the text is considered to be more important than the context. But the context is there. It's pushed back, but the context is still there. It is not something that completely overwhelms the text. The text does not completely overwhelm the context. The context is there, but not in the driver's seat, but in a background. So words are symbols or signs, and they deliver their full meaning only in a particular context. So he is very mindful of the fact that words which are actually symbols or signs, they will deliver meaning only when they are placed in a particular context. I mean, you cannot take something out of the context, because anything taken out of the context becomes dangerous and difficult. You cannot disregard the entire uh, context. Now, meaning is dependent on context, but the context may not always be apparent and easily perceptible. While we understand that meaning is dependent on the context, but we cannot always find the context to a poem. We cannot always find the context to to all literature that we read. Say, suppose you have taken up a book which is written by some new author, and you do not know much about that author, but you like the text, but you like the words on the text. So, what is the context of the writer? We do not know what is the race, milieu, and moment of the writer, but the context context's importance will come when we try to go into deeper analysis of the text. Not always. Context can be at the background. Now, literary compositions are characterized by rich complexity in which certain links are suppressed, or suppressed for concentration of effective and forceful expression. Now, this is interesting because he is trying to present literary compositions as a complex, interrelated chain of expressions, where some links are suppressed and other links are highlighted. For example, which again I think is something that the deconstructionists did work upon, because this suppression of one element over other is something that that deconstruction often talks about, that later criticism often talks about, that why is this suppressed and why is this highlighted. Okay, so for example, in Pride and Prejudice, though we had like 7 marriages or 9 marriages, the linkage of marriage with sexuality was suppressed. There was no mention of sexuality, there was no mention of conjugal life in these in the novel. So while there was marriage, and marriage immediately brings in the context of sexuality and conjugality, marriage was considered as a kind of a social act rather than also a sexual act. So, sorry, this is what I think the context brings into question or brings into light. The rhythm, the significance of the rhythm and meter, which is there in chapter 17, and he does place a lot of impetus on rhythm and meter. So he says that rhythm and its specialized form, meter is the specialized form of rhythm, and they depend upon repetition, expectancy, and they spring from anticipation. So rhythm is something that we anticipate, rhythm is something that is based on repetition, and these are all analytical ideas of Richards. Now, sequences of syllables, both as sounds and as images or speech movements, leave the mind ready for further sequences. So if I do this, then did you expect I will go for the third clap as well? This is what meter and rhythm does. It is in terms of variation in these twists that rhythm is to be described. Now, rhythm is not just about monotonous repetition, but repetition with twists. That is meter, or that is rhythm, according to Richards. But he says that there is no such thing as the effect of a word or a sound. Like, rhythm and meter hardly have anything to do with word or sound, but it's a more of a technical and a supra segmental way of dealing with words and sounds. That's what Richards, or that's what I think Richards meant when he said that there is no effect of word or a sound, which I think is not true. I mean, meter and rhythm does have something to do with words. He says that the sound gets its character by compromise with what is going on already. The preceding agitation of the mind selects from a range of possible characters which the word might present the one which best suits with what is happening. So this is the suppression and highlighting thing as far as the sound and the rhythm is uh, mentioned, that what best suits with what is happening. So the sound, the appreciation of sound will be commensurate with what is going on. Say for example, there is a trumpet being played or there is a wedding being going on. You cannot expect or you cannot imagine the sound of a bomb from somewhere. That would be a jarring effect on the rhythm of the poem, or on the rhythm of the or the meter of the poem. The same definition of rhythm may be extended to the plastic arts and to architecture. Temporal sequence is not strictly necessary for rhythm, though in the vast majority of cases it is involved. So the gap between the speech is not strictly necessary for rhythm according to Richards, but in vast cases it is involved, and he agrees to that. So in metrical reading, the narrowness and definiteness of expectancy, as much unconscious as ever in most cases, is very greatly increased, reaching in some cases, if rhyme is also used, rhyme, the spelling of rhyme, he used this, almost exact precision. Furthermore, what is anticipated becomes to the regularity of time intervals in meter virtually dated. So whereas expectancy, which is not always related to time, but time intervals are very important. For a poetry, if you have a knack for poem, if you write poem, if you study poem, if you read poem, you also have to understand the lapses of time. You need to understand which syllable will take how much time. For example, I'm giving a very, very basic example. I have students whom I ask to read a poem or a line from a novel, and they read it like, oh, and they don't give any comma, or they don't give any full stop, or they don't give any kind of, they don't stop. They think that I have asked them to read, and it is a mechanical thing. And the difference between the way in which they speak and the way in which I speak in the class is that I told them is that I stop when I'm supposed to stop. I start when I'm supposed to start. So there is a time interval, or the sound. The gist of this entire thing is that the sound is dependent upon how you manage time. The appreciation of sound will come only when you can manage the time well. It's like humor, your timing must be perfect. Next, he talks about poetic nature and its truth in Principles of Literary Criticism, and he establishes the value of poetry here. And he means that, as I already pointed out, that by poetry Richards means all imaginative literature, and is that it enables the mind to achieve this poise or system more quickly and completely than it could do otherwise. In art, there is a resolution and balancing of impulses. Poetry is a representation of this uniquely ordered state of mind in which the impulses respond to stimulus in such a manner that the mind has a life's experience. Now, this is what his presentation of psychological understanding is utilized. He is utilizing the ideas of psychology of Shaddington while he is analyzing the value of poetry. He is saying that if you write poetry, if you read poetry, if you draw, if you paint, if you sing or make music, your imbalances will be balanced. You will become a better person. But this particular thing has been criticized a lot, and we will come to the criticisms towards the end of the presentation, and we would see why it is not so. Next is the value of the metaphors. So in 1936, Richards introduced the terms tenor and vehicle to distinguish the two terms of a metaphor, and it is in page number 110 and 96-97. According to Richards' explanation, the tenor of a metaphor is the idea being expressed or the subject of the comparison, while the vehicle of the metaphor is the image by which this idea is conveyed or the subject communicated. So it's very much like signified and signifier. So they interact with each other and constitute the complete metaphor, and this relationship can vary according to the decoration of the tenor, to the now introduction of the vehicle. And the reader, according to Richards, must be aware of the extension of meaning and must attend to both the old and the new meanings together. So the tenor and vehicle are terms associated with practical criticism as far as metaphors are concerned, and he is trying to say by tenor that it is the actual object. Say the camel is the ship of the desert, so the ship is the tenor, and the camel and the desert and the camel is actually the vehicle, with the help of which I said it in a reversed order. The camel is the tenor, and the ship of the desert, the ship is the vehicle, the image with the help of which the camel's extended meaning is presented to us. So the camel is the actual object, and the ship is something that is being compared with the camel, and we have this image of the ship being compared with the camel and getting this idea of the metaphor. We are unpacking the metaphor in two parts. One part is the camel and the other part is the ship. The camel being the main object, and the comparison, which is very different from the camel, is the vehicle. Let's move to the next slide. And he is considered, like Richards is considered to be a new critic with a difference, and I said that I will be talking about this. Alan Tate, Ever Winters, F.R. Lewis, Pen Warren, all of these new critics are very different from Richards on these grounds that I have mentioned here. That Tate did not want to apply even psychology to analyze a poem. Richards used a number of psychological perspectives. So this is one difference, where Tate did not want to use any science on literature, but I. Richards was taking the help of some other sciences like psychology to understand literature. And Ever Winters was ranking or making canons, and he was notorious for that. I. Richards never indulged in ranking or making any kind of hierarchy. Lewis and Warren did not want to stick with one methodology, but Richards, since he wanted this exactitude, which could not have had come by rapidly changing theories and rapidly changing methodologies, wanted to stick with one particular methodology of reading a poem. Either it could be psychology, or it could be semantics, or it could be simply the close reading of the texts. But Lewis and Warren had different ideas. So he could be considered a new critic, but with a difference. And the new critics institutionalized the idealist practice that is based on neo-Kantian aesthetics of disinterest and transcendent value, which is often directed towards religious and cultural conservatism. I mean, Kant also dissociated the text from any kind of logical or any kind of judgmental or reasoning faculties. And the new critics, unlike Richards, wanted to decontextualize the text. So there's the difference between I.A. Richards and new criticism as such. Now this is his psychological approach that I was talking about, that this is how he wanted to use psychology onto literature. So this, we have already discussed about this, and this is where that tragic catharsis, the idea of tragic catharsis, and the idea of I.A. Richards' psychological approach comes together. He says that by reading literature or by writing literature, we achieve a sense of purgation of our troubled feelings. When we look at a piece of art, we forget or we are reminded of our pain, and when pain becomes um, one with the pain that is being depicted in a painting like, say, Guernica by Picasso, then the chaos inside our mind and the chaos in the picture, they unite and create a sense of equilibrium. But his psychological theories have been questioned and have been disregarded now. But when he started utilizing these psychological approaches, they were quite a hit. So what is the connection? What is the relationship between Richards and the New Cambridge criticism? New Cambridge criticism also started the materialist practice of close reading. They indulged in pragmatic aesthetics. They also had utilitarianistic principles. And Richards, as opposed to the new critics, wanted to disengage criticism or the study of literature from this Kantian loop of self-sufficiency and redundancy. And he wanted to put the poem back where it belonged, in the hands of the people who really want to read it, and not just to read it as an exercise separate from all material concerns of life, but as another material concern. Like poetry is also a material to be enjoyed, like like a car or a bus ride, or a bus ride is not really enjoyable unless it's an AC bus. So these kinds of material things. So we Richards asks us that we are not focusing only on the work itself, but its effect on the audience also. Its context is there, but its context is subdued. The audience is there, but the audience's affective fallacies are not always taken into consideration. Let's move on. So, talking about the achievements of Richards, René Vellec says that the stimulus that Richards gave to English and American criticism, particularly Empson and Kenneth Brooks, by turning it resolutely to the question of language, its meaning and function in poetry, will always ensure his position in any history of modern criticism. And this is this image that I have taken from Norton Critical Anthology talks about the centrality of the work, which I think is taken from this practical criticism, where work somehow appears to be at the center of all. The artist, the audience, and the universe will come later, but the work, if it exists, matters, and matters most. So he reinstated the value of the work, and this, according to this image, the work is the central focal point. And by also providing this opportunity for dissociating the text from historical pedantry, I think Richard opened the access of the text to the layman like us, who could interpret the text independently of scholarly interventions. I mean, when I was reading New Criticism, I really applauded it and I tried to follow it as much as possible. That, I mean, if you are a student, if you do not have enough money to buy like 10 books that your teacher prescribed, and you just enjoy the text and you write your impressions, write whatever you understand from the text, then isn't it less costly for students of a country which is still developing? That's entirely my personal way of looking at thing, and I applaud Richards for starting this debate. Yes, he was criticized, as I pointed out, that there was this, I mean, the simplistic psychological approach that art will create some kind of harmony inside you could be wrong. And René Vellec is saying that there are madmen and scoundrels among great poets, and one of the examples is Christopher Marlowe, who I won't say he's a bad person, but he was murdered, and he also like was a spy, and he drank a lot, and he was an opium eater, and so on and so forth. And so I've just created this meme, so you know to make this criticism more visual. Now, exactitude of poetic measurements, and this is something that this video that I don't know if, can you hear the video, Dr. Banerjee?
Once these questions have been answered, determining the poem's greatness becomes a relatively simple
Can
matter.
somebody tell me if
If the poem's
the
score
video is
section plotted
audible?
on the horizontal of a graph, and its importance is plotted on the vertical, then calculating the total area of the poem
I don't know if it
yields
is,
the measure of
but
its
this
greatness.
particular snippet is taken from Dead Poets Society, and I think we are running short of time as well, where the teacher asks the a few pages of the books to be ripped out, because they are talking about this kind of exactitude of poetic measurements, about rhythm, about tone, about the greatness and the sharpness and the lull of the music, and so on and so forth. Many many later critics, did point out to this fault, or they found fault in Richard's idea that you cannot measure a poem, or measure even the misinterpretations or the obstacles of a poem only by these parameters. There could be so many other parameters. I mean, one of the parameters that Richards missed by a huge margin is the fact that when I read, say, daffodils, I do not know if India has daffodils like I don't remember seeing daffodils in Kolkata, or I don't know if a nightingale sings in our country, or if I would like to compare my friend with a summer's day. I mean, talking from Kolkata. So these things are something that can be used as criticisms against Richards. Let's move on to the next. Okay, so this is the bibliography. This is a very short bibliography, and this is not really very updated. But I think you can, if you want to start doing your research on Richards, then I think this is the place where you begin, and you can take a screenshot, or you can just have the PPT at the end, and I've just put it out here. So thank you. That's all I had to say, or I had to discuss about I.A. Richards, and this is my email ID. You can email your comments, or I can see them from the chat box, and we can go for a little bit of question answers now while I look at the chat. Over to you, Dr. Banerjee.
Thank you, Dr. Brish. It was really a very enjoyable session. We enjoyed your memes, and the memes were very effective in explaining the concepts. I think this is the way, the job for teacher is to ease teachers. That is what you have exactly done today, and I'm sure today's session has been a great validation to our participants about their understanding of I.A. Richards and practical criticism. May I request the participants to please post your questions in the chat box if any. Although the numbers of the participants are few today, but may I request you all to please post your questions. Pritish said that sometimes he danced in the class and that backfired.
Yeah, I mean,
something I would like to explore.
Yeah, I mean, that was really a disaster. And at that point in time, my principal was walking near my class, and he saw that I was making these monkey-like movements, and he asked me later that what were you doing? I said that I was trying to dance. Okay.
There's a question by Gargi's idea, and Gargi says that what is the exact idea of experimental aesthetics of A. Richards?
Well, yeah, so I can't say the exact idea of Richard's experimental aesthetics, but what I can say is that on one hand, Richards is saying that aesthetics is not the playground of just aesthetically minded people. It can be practiced, it can be controlled, it can be understood. Because I am using one anecdote that he shared once in an interview. He said that one of these people came up and said that, you know, it's the more difficult a poem is, the greater is the value of the poet. And this is also something that goes on in our academia, that if you cannot understand a poem, it must be great. Some people have this idea. And Richards was of the view that no, that is not the case. If the aesthetics is, there is no aesthetics, there is no way of looking at a text that cannot be, if it cannot be understood, then it is not really coherent. And in his experiments, he did point out to these aspects, that as to why a particular poem was not appreciated, because there was either this doctrinal problem faced by the poet. The students, one of the students might have had thought that this poem might have been written by an Asian, or or this poem glorifies Africa or Asia, and hence this does not conform to my Nazi doctrine, and hence it will not be a good poem, is something that is being discussed in these experimental aesthetics. And since it was experimental way back in the early decades of the 20th century, because psychology was not a very established practice back then. So that's why it has this aura of experimentalism. Okay, so there is another question by Ganesh D. Sutar, and
Yeah.
yeah, he is asking what are the key differences between practical criticism and literary criticism. Literary criticism is an umbrella term within which practical criticism is one of the criticisms, and practical criticism is, to be technically correct, is more of the name of a book rather than a practice. But practical criticism is something that is one of the ways in which literary criticism can be carried out, where the ideas of some science is incorporated into the analysis of the text, which has been discontinued in many aspects of literary criticism which we do now. I mean, if you say that okay, I am going to use the theories of Einstein to analyze a poem, then many people would call you out and would say that no, this is not how you appreciate a literary text. So that is those are the basic differences I think are there between practical criticism and literary criticism. Though practical criticism and literary criticism should not be compared as such.
I urge you to read the comment of Ranbir Wangam.
Okay.
It's a very interesting comment.
Okay, he's saying focusing on a lecture has never been easier with all these memes and humors. Yes, I wish I could listen to lectures like you more often. I consider this one to be a. I'll take a screenshot and make it put it in my CV.
Vishaka also appreciates your
Thank you.
way of teaching, and Vishaka has a question. I would like to ask you about the result of your experiment with the steady state of a writer.
Oh yes. I mean, I was smoking. I never smoke. Like I said, I do not like smoking. But I thought, okay, let's
Yes.
see if smoking makes me write really great. I mean, I would be like Coleridge. No, I had a burning sensation in my throat. That's it. I couldn't write well. I couldn't write better. So don't write. Like, if you are not a smoker, if you don't drink while you write, then I would say that you don't do that. I mean, it will only create problems for your health, which it did for me. So
I think these are excuses, in my opinion, which during the days, college days, or high school days,
mhm.
which is a very common statement, which is made by people who are already addicted. So I think this is a kind of a look take you with that team, but
Yeah.
it never helps.
No, it never helps. It
Sure,
never helps.
I have
No.
that same experience which you have just shared. Now,
Yeah.
Zovia has asked something you might read, which is not
Related, but since we are like we have a less number of people here, I can try to do that. Um, what is the necessity of doing PhD? No, it's not a necessity of doing because even in the latest directive by UGC, you do not have to have a PhD to apply for a post in a college or a university. So it's not a necessity, but from the perspective of the job market, uh, I think you have to have it if you want promotions or if you want to get a job in a university or a college. But why, if we are talking about, if you love literature, then PhD is one of the highest or most engaging ways in which you can study literature, I think. But whoever told you that you must do a PhD, I don't think he or she was thinking straight about job. But if you want a job in the academics, willy nilly, I mean, in some time in near future, you have to do a PhD because it's essential for you to get a promotion, and sometimes it earns you a lot of numbers. Like you can get 30 marks if you have a PhD in the interview score sheet. So in that sense, a PhD is essential. But if you don't want to do a PhD and you just want to not do this, then I don't see why is it important. But PhD is the way. PhD is the battle with your ignorant self, because here you take a topic and you go so much inside it that you become an expert on that. Say like Dr. Banerjee, you are an expert on drama, or what was your expertise?
a very scary statement. I would never say. I just tried to locate the evolution of short stories in the world and
Oh,
in
short
India,
stories. Yes. So, I
and
mean, he
I'm
would
still
know.
locating it.
Yeah, of course. I mean, PhD, as I said, is one of the highest. It's not the highest. I mean, you can always go on, but you will know a lot about that particular topic. Like, Dr. Banerjee would know a lot more than I do about the way short stories have evolved. So I think that's your answer. I don't know if I could answer it well.
I'll just like to add,
Hmm.
she writes in that
Hmm.
someone questioned her
Hmm.
about the necessity of doing PhD in English literature,
Hmm.
as doing PhD in English literature is not something numerical.
No, it's not numerical. I mean,
I think that this the same discourse or same debate about the value addition of a PhD in arts or in literature as compared to a value addition in science or something which is technologically based. I think this is that question. The question basically means
yeah,
that.
I mean, since we are discussing, I can simply say that, um, you know, I think PhD in itself is useless. I mean, I have done my PhD on comic studies. I just teach one text in the entire syllabus. Why do I? What is the relevance of my PhD thesis to my students? None. But you can't say that in the interview and get away with it. So if you are in literature, if you are hearing this, if you are interested in an academic job, well, you better do your PhD.
Yeah,
No way out.
PhD is a must
Yeah.
nowadays. That too, that will not guarantee you a job.
No,
I might
no.
be sounding depressing, but that is the reality.
No, no, no. That will not guarantee you a job, but that can give you 30 marks. Like in many UGC, yeah, I mean, I apply to a lot of jobs which I do not get ever, and they have like these 30 marks for PhD. 30
Yes.
marks, matters a lot.
Muskan has given a response, a statement. I think you should read
Yeah.
about again your pedagogy.
So I personally had an amazing time while learning from you. The design of your presentation was against the wind. Yes, I have taken notes. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. God bless you too.
So I think it would not be an exaggeration to say that we have had a great time today as usual. Whenever Dr. Pritish comes on our board, and it is people, energetic, ardent researchers like Dr. Pritish who adds a great value addition to our board, our various lecture series. And we, on behalf of Team Dadwaj, would always like to thank ardent researchers like Dr. Pritish. On behalf of Team Dadwaj, I thank you for an enriching session
Thank you
and
so
hope
much.
to see you again on this platform in the near future.
Sure,
Please
sure.
take care. Good night.
Good night. Good night, Dr. Banerjee.
Recording stopped.